On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Gerald Foss stood inside a barn that smelled like motor oil and cold iron, and watched a man from Delco Remy explain, with the patient condescension of someone who has rehearsed this speech many times, why the alternator rebuilding business was finished. The man's name was Philip Adler. He wore a company jacket and carried a clipboard, and he had driven 3 hours from Anderson, Indiana, to deliver this news in person, which Gerald thought was a strange amount of effort for a company that was, as Philip Adler explained it, simply evolving with the times. The times, as Philip saw them, meant offshore manufacturing, cheaper cores, and a distribution model that didn't require men like Gerald Foss standing in cold barns in Hardin County, Iowa, rewinding copper wire by hand. Gerald listened to all of it. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He thanked Philip Adler for driving 3 hours and walked him back to his company car and watched the taillights disappear down the county road. Then he went back inside the barn and picked up the alternator he'd been working on before Philip arrived, and he kept working. Let me tell you about Gerald Foss because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built, and you need to understand what he built before you can understand why, 35 years later, it still matters. Gerald was 44 years old in 1987. He had grown up on his father's farm outside Eldora, Iowa, the second of 4 boys, and he had learned early that the land gave you what you put into it, and nothing more, and nothing less. And he had applied that logic to everything else in his life with a consistency that some people found admirable, and others found exhausting. He had a degree from Iowa State in agricultural mechanics, which in 1965 meant he understood how machines worked well enough to fix them, and well enough to know when they couldn't be fixed, and well enough to know the difference between those two things, which was a rarer skill than most people realized. He had farmed for 12 years, then spent 6 years as a mechanic at a John Deere dealership in Iowa Falls. Then, in 1978, he had taken the $14,000 he had saved and bought a lathe and a winding machine and a test bench and converted the old dairy barn on his property into what he called, without any particular ceremony, the shop. He rebuilt alternators and starters and generators. He did it for farmers and truckers and implement dealers and small engine shops within about a 60-mile radius of Eldora. He charged fair prices. He stood behind his work. He had rebuilt, by his own rough count, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 units in 9 years, by the time Philip Adler showed up to tell him the industry was moving on. The industry was moving on. That part was true. Let me tell you about what moving on looked like in 1987, because it's important to understand what Gerald was up against, and it's important to understand it in concrete terms rather than abstract ones. The big rebuilding houses, the ones that had supplied rebuilt alternators to auto parts stores and dealerships across the Midwest, were consolidating. The smaller regional rebuilders, the men who operated out of barns and machine shops in towns like Eldora and Ames and Marshalltown, were being squeezed from 2 directions at once. On one side, the big consolidators were offering rebuilt units at prices the small shops couldn't match. On the other side, the import cores, the raw alternators coming in from South Korea and Taiwan, and eventually China, were flooding the market at prices that made even the consolidated domestic rebuilders nervous. A rebuilt alternator from a regional shop like Gerald's cost somewhere between $65 and $110 depending on the application. A new import unit, sitting on the shelf at the parts store, cost $45. The math was not complicated. The math was, in fact, the reason Philip Adler had driven 3 hours to deliver his speech. Gerald understood the math. He had understood it for about 2 years before Philip showed up. What Gerald did not believe, and what he had never believed, was that the math was the whole story. Let me tell you about what Gerald knew that Philip Adler did not, because this is where the story actually begins. Gerald had been rebuilding alternators long enough to know that not all alternators were the same, and he had been in Hardin County long enough to know that not all customers were the same either. The farmers he served, the ones who ran aging 402s and 4440s and older international equipment, were not buying alternators the way a person buys a loaf of bread. They were buying them the way a person buys a part for something they intend to keep running for another 20 years. They needed units that were rewound correctly, that had the right wire gauge for the application, that were tested under load before they left the shop. They needed someone who could look at a burned-out field coil and tell them whether the problem was the alternator or the voltage regulator or a draw somewhere else in the system. Because if you just swapped the alternator and left the real problem in place, you'd be back in 6 months with another burned unit, and you'd have paid twice. A $45 import unit sitting in a box at the parts store couldn't do any of that. It could sit in the box. That was what it was designed to do. Gerald also knew something about the cores themselves, about the raw material of his trade that the import market was beginning to obscure. The old domestic cores, the Delco Remis, and the Lease Nevilles, and the Motorola's that had been built in American factories in the 1960s and 1970s, were built to a standard of copper and steel that the new import units weren't matching. The stator windings in a good domestic core used heavier gauge wire. The rotors were balanced to tighter tolerances. The housings were cast from better aluminum. Gerald knew this, not because someone had told him, but because he had cut open thousands of them and looked at what was inside, and he had kept notes, and he had a filing cabinet in the corner of the shop with index cards on probably 300 different alternator models going back to 1958, and on each card he had written down the wire gauge, the number of turns, the resistance values, and his own notes about what failed and why and what the fix was. This was not a database. It was not a computer. It was a filing cabinet and a man's handwriting and 30 years of paying attention. That filing cabinet was what Philip Adler had driven 3 hours to make obsolete. Gerald kept working. Let me tell you about the next 3 years because they were the years that determined everything that came after. Between 1987 and 1990, about half the regional rebuilders in central Iowa closed. Some of them sold their equipment. Some of them took jobs with the consolidators. Some of them just locked the barn and walked away. Gerald watched all of it. He didn't say much about it to anyone except his wife, Dorothy, who had kept the shop's books since 1978 and who had a clearer view of the financial situation than Gerald sometimes allowed himself to have. Dorothy told him in the spring of 1988 that they had lost about 30% of their volume in 18 months. Gerald said he knew. Dorothy said she thought he should know the number specifically, not just approximately. The number specifically was that they had billed $61,000 in 1986 and $43,000 in 1987, and were on pace for something around $38,000 in 1988. Gerald looked at the numbers for a while. Then he said he thought they needed to find the customers who couldn't be served by a box on a shelf, and he thought there were more of them than the industry believed. He was right, but it took time to prove it, and the time was not comfortable. Let me tell you about what Gerald did in 1988 and 1989, because it was not what most people in his position did, and it explains everything that happened afterward. While the other regional rebuilders were closing or consolidating, Gerald was driving. He put 22,000 miles on his truck in 1988, driving to farms and implement shops and small fleet operations within 80 miles of Eldora. He wasn't selling. He was asking questions. He wanted to know what equipment people were running, how old it was, what electrical problems they'd been having, and whether the parts store had been able to help them. What he found, farm by farm and shop by shop, was a category of customer that the import market had not accounted for and could not serve. These were the operators of older equipment that was 10 or 20 or 30 years old, equipment for which the import rebuilders weren't stocking cores because the volume wasn't there to justify it. A farmer running a 1968 International 1456 with a Motorola alternator couldn't walk into the parts store and buy a replacement. The parts store didn't stock it. The consolidators didn't rebuild it. The import market didn't touch it. But Gerald had the core on his shelf, and he had the index card in his filing cabinet, and he could rebuild it in 2 days and test it under load and hand it back with a 1-year warranty. He also found something else. He found that the farmers who had tried the import units were, in a significant number of cases, not happy. Not because the units didn't work initially. Most of them worked fine out of the box. But they didn't last. A farmer named Dale Schroeder outside of Grundy Center told Gerald in the fall of 1988 that he'd put 3 import alternators on his 4440 in 2 years, and he was done with them. Dale said the third one had failed during corn harvest, which was about the worst possible time for an alternator to fail, and he had sat in the field for 4 hours waiting for his son to bring a replacement from Iowa Falls. 4 hours during corn harvest, Dale said, was not a small thing. Gerald rebuilt him a Delco 10SI with new windings and a heavy-duty rectifier bridge, and Dale Schroeder never called him about an alternator again, which was exactly the outcome Gerald wanted. Word moved the way word moves in a small county, slowly and then all at once. Let me tell you about 1991 because 1991 was the year things changed in a way Gerald had not entirely planned for, but had, in a sense, made inevitable. By the spring of that year, Gerald had rebuilt his customer base to something close to its 1986 level. But the composition of it had shifted entirely. He was no longer doing much work for the auto parts stores or the new car dealerships. That business was gone, and he didn't pursue it. What he had instead was a dense network of farmers, custom operators, and small fleet managers who ran older equipment and who had learned, through experience, that Gerald's work lasted longer than the alternative. He had also, through the driving and the asking of questions, identified something he had not expected to find: a secondary market for the cores themselves. Farmers and collectors who were restoring old equipment, who needed original specification alternators for machines that were 30 or 40 years old, had no reliable source for correctly rebuilt units. Gerald began advertising in 2 small restoration publications, one out of Decorah and one out of Ottumwa, and within 6 months he was shipping rebuilt units to customers in 14 states. Dorothy updated the books. The 1991 billing came to $71,000. It was the best year the shop had ever had. Philip Adler did not drive back to deliver a follow-up speech. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched an industry tell a man that his skills were no longer needed, and then watched that man quietly prove the industry wrong? Not by fighting the industry, not by making speeches about it, not by writing letters to anyone, but simply by continuing to do the work better than anyone else was willing to do it? because that's what Gerald Foss did between 1987 and 1991, and it's worth sitting with that for a moment before the story moves forward, because the story is about to get more complicated. Let me tell you about the barn, because the barn is important, and because most people who drove past it on County Road D35 had no idea what was inside it. From the road, it looked like any other dairy conversion in Hardin County, a white-painted structure with a gambrel roof and a concrete apron in front and a yard light on a pole that came on at dusk. The sign Gerald had put up in 1978 said Foss Electrical Rebuilding in black letters on a white board, and the letters had faded to the point where you had to know what you were looking at to read them. Inside, it was something else. The lathe was a 1954 South Bend 13-inch that Gerald had bought at an estate sale in Webster City for $200 and rebuilt himself. The winding machine was a 1961 Acme Electric that had come from a shop in Waterloo that had closed in 1975. The test bench Gerald had built himself from a 1949 Ford flathead engine block that he had bolted to a welded steel frame and connected to a variable speed drive, and it would load test an alternator at any amperage from 10 to 120 amps, which was more than most commercial test benches of the era could manage. The varnish tank for impregnating the stator windings was a 55-gallon drum with a heating element Gerald had wired himself. None of it was new. None of it was impressive to look at. All of it worked. The filing cabinet was in the corner nearest the door, a 4-drawer steel unit painted battleship gray, and the index cards were organized by manufacturer, and then by model number, and then by year. By 1991, there were roughly 600 cards. By 1995, there were over 900. Gerald added a card every time he encountered a unit he hadn't worked on before, and he updated existing cards when he found something new. If you asked him where the information on a particular unit had come from, he would open the drawer and pull out the card and show you his handwriting and say, "I opened one up and looked." That was the whole methodology. Open it up and look. Let me tell you about the summer of 1994, because that was when the first of what Gerald would later call the drop-offs happened, and the drop-offs are the reason this story has the shape it does. A farmer named Merle Haugen from outside of Ackley pulled into the concrete apron one morning in July with a rusted alternator in a 5-gallon bucket. Merle explained that it had come off a 1963 Minneapolis Moline G1000 that his father had bought new and that he was trying to restore. He had called 3-part stores and 2 rebuilders, and none of them would touch it. Gerald looked at it. It was a Motorola unit, heavily corroded, with a cracked end frame and a burned stator. He told Merle it would take 2 weeks and cost $85. Merle said that was fine. Gerald rebuilt it, found a used end frame in his parts inventory that fit after some machining, rewound the stator to original specification, and had it ready in 10 days. Merle Haugen told someone, who told someone, and within a year Gerald was getting drop-offs from across Iowa, and then from Minnesota and Nebraska, and eventually from as far as Ohio and Tennessee. People would ship cores to him in boxes wrapped in newspaper. They would drive them out in person. One man from Missouri drove 6 hours each way with 3 alternators in a cardboard box because he said he'd heard Gerald was the only person left who could do them right. Gerald rebuilt all of them. Dorothy started a waiting list in 1996. The waiting list was, at various points in the late 1990s, between 6 and 14 weeks long. Let me tell you about what was happening in the industry during those same years, because the contrast matters and because it tells you something about what happens when an entire sector decides that old things have no value. The domestic alternator rebuilding industry, the commercial side of it, continued to consolidate and offshore through the 1990s. The big rebuilders moved more and more of their core processing to Mexico and then to China. The quality of the rebuilt units on the parts store shelves declined in ways that were measurable if you knew what to measure and invisible if you didn't. Gerald knew what to measure. He was seeing the evidence of it on his test bench, in the form of failed import units that customers brought in after the warranty had expired and the parts store had shrugged. He would cut them open, and he would look, and he would add notes to his index cards about what the import units were doing differently, and what it cost the customer when they did it. He was building a case file without intending to build a case file. He was just paying attention. Let me tell you about 1998, because 1998 was the year Gerald did something that surprised even Dorothy. He was 55 years old. The shop was busier than it had ever been. The waiting list was at 11 weeks. Dorothy had suggested, more than once, that he might consider taking on help, a younger mechanic or an apprentice, someone who could handle the volume and learn the trade and eventually take over some of the work. Gerald had been thinking about it. He had also been thinking about something else, which was the filing cabinet, and what would happen to the information in it if something happened to him. Not a morbid thought, he told Dorothy. A practical one. He had 900 index cards representing 30 years of looking inside alternators, and there was no copy of any of it. And if the barn burned down or he died or simply stopped working, that information was gone. And the information was, he'd come to understand, the actual product he was selling. The rebuilt alternators were the delivery mechanism. The knowledge was the thing. So, in the fall of 1998, Gerald Foss, who had never owned a computer and who typed with 2 fingers, sat down with a woman from the Eldora Library named Karen Stiles, who ran a basic computing class on Tuesday evenings, and he learned to use a word processor. It took him 4 months. At the end of 4 months, he began transcribing the index cards. He did it in the evenings after the shop closed, 2 or 3 cards a night, and it took him until 2001 to finish. The resulting document was 214 pages long. Gerald printed 3 copies. He gave one to Dorothy. He put one in a fireproof box in the house. He kept one in the shop. He did not publish it. He did not sell it. He did not put it on the internet, which was a thing he had heard about but did not use. He had simply made sure the information would survive him. And that was enough. Let me tell you about the morning in April of 2003 when a man named Robert Caskey pulled into the concrete apron in a pickup truck with Indiana plates and changed the direction of the shop in a way Gerald had not anticipated. Robert Caskey was 38 years old and worked as a purchasing manager for a company in Fort Wayne that supplied parts to vintage tractor restorers and small fleet operators across the eastern Midwest. He had heard about Gerald through a man in Ohio who had shipped alternators to Eldora. He had driven to Iowa specifically to talk to Gerald, not to drop off a core, but to have a conversation. He wanted to know if Gerald would be interested in a wholesale arrangement, in which Gerald would rebuild units for Caskey's company to sell through their catalog under a private label. The volume would be significant. Caskey said he thought they could move 200 to 300 units a year initially, possibly more. Gerald listened to all of it. Then he said he had a waiting list at 11 weeks, and he wasn't sure he could take on volume without compromising the work. Caskey said he understood that. He said he wasn't looking for speed. He was looking for quality that he could stand behind, and he had heard that Gerald's work was the only quality in the market for the applications he needed. Gerald said he would think about it. He talked to Dorothy that evening. Dorothy said she thought they should do it, but only if they took on help first, and only if Gerald was willing to train the help himself, so the work stayed consistent. Gerald said he thought that was right. He hired a young man named Travis Holst from Iowa Falls in the summer of 2003. Travis was 24 years old and had grown up on a farm and could take apart a small engine before he was 12. Gerald spent 6 months teaching him the trade the way Gerald had learned it, which was by opening things up and looking. Travis learned to read the index cards. He learned to use the winding machine and the lathe and the test bench. He learned Gerald's testing protocol, which involved running every rebuilt unit at full load for 45 minutes before it left the shop, a standard that no commercial rebuilder Gerald knew of was still using. By the spring of 2004, Travis could rebuild most of the common applications without supervision. Gerald began taking the Caskey wholesale work. The waiting list dropped to 4 weeks. Dorothy updated the books. The 2004 billing came to $118,000. Let me tell you about what was happening in the broader market in 2004 and 2005, because the broader market was about to do something that would make Gerald's filing cabinet and Gerald's test bench and Gerald's index cards look, to the people who had dismissed them, like something they should have paid closer attention to. The Chinese alternator imports that had been flooding the American market since the early 1990s had, by 2004, reached a quality nadir that was becoming impossible to ignore. The failure rates on certain import applications were running, by some estimates, as high as 30% within the first year. Fleet operators who had switched entirely to import units were seeing electrical system failures at rates that were costing them real money in downtime and warranty claims. The parts stores were processing returns at volumes that were cutting into their margins. And the domestic rebuilding industry, which had largely offshored its own operations by this point, was not positioned to offer a better alternative because it had spent 15 years optimizing for price rather than quality. Gerald was positioned to offer a better alternative. He had spent 15 years optimizing for quality rather than price. He had done it quietly in a barn in Hardin County, Iowa, with a lathe from 1954 and a winding machine from 1961 and a test bench built from a flathead Ford engine, and he had 900 index cards and a 214-page document, and a young man named Travis who could rebuild a Delco 10SY in 3.5 hours to a standard that nothing coming off a container ship could match. The phone started ringing in ways it hadn't rung before. Let me tell you about the call that came in October of 2005, because it was the call that Gerald had not expected and that Dorothy said later she probably should have expected, because she had been watching the numbers long enough to know that what Gerald was doing was not a small thing, even if Gerald himself treated it like a small thing. The call came from a fleet manager in Des Moines named Gary Waverly, who ran a company that operated 140-grain trucks across central Iowa. Gary had switched his fleet to import alternators in 1999 to cut costs. In 2005, he was replacing alternators at a rate of about 60 units a year across the fleet, which was running him somewhere between $3,500 and $4,200 in parts alone, not counting labor and downtime. He had heard about Gerald through Robert Caskey. He wanted to know if Gerald could rebuild his cores to a standard that would last longer. Gerald said he could. Gary asked what the warranty was. Gerald said 1 year, unconditional. Gary asked what the price was. Gerald quoted him $58 per unit for his most common application, which was more than the import units but less than what Gary was spending on the import units when you factored in the replacement rate. Gary Waverly sent Gerald 30 cores in November of 2005. Gerald and Travis rebuilt all of them and shipped them back by December. Gary installed them across his fleet over the winter. In the 2 years that followed, Gary returned 4 units under warranty, 4 out of 30. The import units had been running at roughly 18 failures per 30 units per year. Gary Waverly called Gerald in the fall of 2007 and said he wanted to send the rest of the fleet's cores. He also said, and Gerald wrote this down because he thought Dorothy would want to see it, that he had been in the trucking business for 22 years, and he had never in his life had a parts supplier call him back to ask how the units were holding up. Gerald had called him in March of 2006 to ask exactly that. Gary said it was the first time anyone had done that. Gerald said he just wanted to know if they were working. Let me tell you about 2008, because 2008 was a year that tested a lot of things in a lot of industries, and the alternator rebuilding business was not exempt. The financial crisis hit fleet operators and farmers hard. Capital dried up. Equipment purchases slowed. The used equipment market flooded with machines that people couldn't afford to maintain, which paradoxically meant that the demand for quality rebuilds of older units went up, because people who couldn't buy new equipment needed to keep old equipment running, and keeping old equipment running meant finding someone who could fix the parts that nobody stocked anymore. Gerald's waiting list went back up to 8 weeks in the spring of 2009. Travis hired his younger brother Aaron in the fall of 2009 to handle the incoming volume. Gerald spent 3 months training Aaron the same way he had trained Travis. Dorothy updated the books. The 2009 billing came to $156,000. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened at the Hardin County Farm Bureau banquet in February of 2010, because it is the conversation that most directly addresses the title of this story, and because it involves a man named Dennis Farrell, who had been the service manager at the Case IH dealership in Iowa Falls for 19 years, and who had, in those 19 years, sent exactly 0 work to Gerald Foss. Dennis Farrell was the kind of man who believed that if a thing wasn't on the approved vendor list, it didn't exist, and the approved vendor list at his dealership ran through the corporate supply chain and did not include barns on County Road D35. Dennis had watched Gerald's operation from a distance for years with the particular skepticism of a man who has institutional backing and cannot imagine why anyone would choose a different arrangement. He was not hostile to Gerald. He simply did not take him seriously, and he had said so in terms that were not unkind but were not ambiguous at the banquet 2 years earlier, when someone had mentioned Gerald's name in connection with a difficult alternator application. Dennis had smiled and said he was sure Gerald did fine work for the people who needed that kind of thing. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dennis started talking about something else. Gerald had heard about the comment secondhand. He hadn't said anything about it. At the 2010 banquet, Dennis Farrell found himself seated 2 chairs down from Gerald Foss, and the conversation turned, as it often did in February of 2010, to the state of the parts supply chain and the difficulty of sourcing electrical components for older equipment. Dennis mentioned that his dealership had been having significant trouble with alternator returns on certain late-model applications, units that were failing within the warranty period at a rate that was causing problems with customers and with the corporate warranty department. He said the supply chain had gotten unreliable and the quality had gotten inconsistent, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. He said this to the table generally, not to Gerald specifically. Gerald said quietly that he might be able to help with some of those applications. Dennis looked at him for a moment. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. He said he appreciated that, but his dealership had to work through approved vendors, and he didn't think Gerald's shop would meet the certification requirements. Gerald said he understood. He said if Dennis ever wanted to send a core over just to see what the work looked like, he was welcome to do that. Dennis said he'd keep it in mind. He drove out to the barn on County Road D35 6 weeks later with a core in the back of his truck. He didn't call ahead. He pulled into the concrete apron, and Gerald came out of the shop, and Dennis handed him the core and said he'd been having trouble with this application specifically. 3 failures in 8 months on the same unit. Gerald looked at it. He said he thought he knew what the problem was. He said, "Come back in 3 days." Dennis came back in 3 days. Gerald handed him the rebuilt unit and the old index card for that application, which he had updated with notes about what he'd found inside the failed unit. Dennis read the card. He asked if Gerald had seen this failure mode before. Gerald said yes. He'd seen it on 4 units in the past 2 years, all from the same production run, and he'd documented what he found each time. Dennis asked how Gerald had known to look for that specific issue. Gerald said he always looked for everything. That was the protocol. You ran it at full load for 45 minutes, and you watched the numbers, and if anything moved that shouldn't move, you opened it back up and looked until you found out why. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has your waiting list been?" Gerald said 8 weeks, give or take. Dennis said he could work with that. "Let me tell you about the years between 2010 and 2018, because they were the years in which what Gerald had built stopped being a barn operation and started being something harder to name." The dealership work from Dennis Farrell's shop came in steadily and grew. Robert Caskey's catalog business continued. Gary Waverly's fleet continued to send cores. And the restoration market, the farmers and collectors who needed correctly rebuilt units for machines that the industry had stopped serving 30 years earlier, kept finding Gerald the way they had always found him, which was through word of mouth and through the kind of reputation that takes a long time to build, and, once built, does not require maintenance. Travis and Aaron were both working full-time. Gerald was 67 in 2010 and 75 in 2018, and he was still in the shop every day, still pulling cards from the filing cabinet, still running the test bench himself for anything he wasn't sure about. He had added perhaps 200 cards since 2001. The 214-page document had been updated twice. Dorothy had learned to use a computer herself by this point and had transferred the shop's records to a spreadsheet, though she kept the paper ledgers as well because she trusted paper. The barn had not changed. The South Bend lathe was still there. The Acme electric winding machine was still there. The test bench, built from the Flathead Ford, was still there. Gerald had replaced the heating element in the varnish tank twice. He had replaced the drive belt on the lathe once. He had not replaced the lathe. Let me tell you about 2019, because 2019 was the year the last of the major domestic alternator rebuilding houses that Gerald had competed with in 1987 announced it was closing its American operations and moving final assembly to Vietnam. The announcement was made in a press release that used words like strategic realignment and global optimization and supply chain efficiency, which were words that meant the same thing Philip Adler's words had meant in 1987, which was that the people making the decision had decided that American labor and American knowledge were costs to be eliminated rather than assets to be maintained. Gerald read about it in a trade publication that Travis had left on the workbench. He read it once. He set it down. He picked up the alternator he'd been working on and kept working. Travis asked him what he thought about it. Gerald said he thought it was a shame for the people who worked there. He said he didn't think it changed much for them. Travis asked why not. Gerald said because the people who needed what they did hadn't changed. The equipment was still out there. The cores were still coming in. The filing cabinet was still in the corner. Travis said that was probably right. Gerald said it was definitely right, and he handed Travis the rebuilt unit and told him to put it on the test bench. Let me tell you about the afternoon in the fall of 2021 when Dennis Farrell drove out to the barn for the last time before Gerald retired, because it is a scene that closes the loop on a conversation that had started 11 years earlier at a Farm Bureau banquet. Dennis had been sending work to Gerald for a decade by then. He had long since stopped thinking about approved vendor lists. He pulled into the concrete apron and Gerald came out and they stood in the September sun, and Dennis said he wanted to ask Gerald something he'd been meaning to ask for a while. He wanted to know how Gerald had known, back in 1987 when the whole industry was moving on, that there would still be enough customers to keep the shop going. Gerald thought about it for a moment. He said he hadn't known. He said he had just believed that if you did the work right, the people who needed the work done right would find you eventually. Dennis said that sounded like faith more than strategy. Gerald said he supposed it was both. Dennis asked what was going to happen to the shop when Gerald retired. Gerald said Travis was going to take it over. He said Travis had been ready for 5 years and had just been too polite to say so. Dennis laughed. He said he thought that was probably true. Gerald retired in the spring of 2022. He was 79 years old. The shop did not close. Travis Holst took over the operation, and Aaron continued working, and the waiting list at the time of the transition was at 9 weeks. The filing cabinet stayed in the corner. The 214-page document, now updated to 287 pages and stored in 3 printed copies and on 2 USB drives, stayed in the fireproof box. The South Bend lathe stayed. The Acme electric winding machine stayed. The test bench built from the flathead Ford stayed. Gerald gave Travis one piece of instruction at the handover, which was this: if you don't know what's wrong with it, open it up and look. Travis said he knew. Gerald said he knew Travis knew. He just wanted to say it anyway. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Gerald's retirement, and it doesn't end with Travis at the bench, and it doesn't end with the filing cabinet in the corner, though all of those things are part of what it means. The story ends, if it ends anywhere, with a question that Philip Adler's company never had to answer, and that the press release about strategic realignment and global optimization never had to answer, which is this: what happens to the knowledge? When a factory goes overseas, the machines go with it, or they're scrapped, and the workers find other work, and the supply chain shifts, and after a few years it's as if the thing never existed in a particular place. The market adjusts. The press release moves on. But the knowledge, the specific accumulated knowledge of how a particular thing works and why it fails, and what the fix is, that knowledge doesn't transfer automatically. It lives in the people who did the work. It lives in the filing cabinets and the index cards and the 287-page documents of the people who paid attention long enough to write it down. And when those people are gone, and when the filing cabinets are gone, the knowledge is gone, and the market discovers, usually slowly and usually at some cost, that it needed that knowledge more than it knew. Gerald Foss is 81 years old. He still comes into the shop on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He doesn't rebuild units anymore. He reads the cards when Travis has a question, and he looks at the test bench numbers when something doesn't add up. And occasionally he opens a unit up himself just to see what's inside. The South Bend lathe is still running. The Acme electric winding machine is still running. The test bench built from the flathead Ford is still running. And somewhere in a warehouse in Vietnam, in a factory that makes alternators for a fraction of what Gerald charges, there is no filing cabinet in the corner, and there are no index cards, and there is no man who has been opening things up and looking for 45 years and writing down what he found. That's the difference between a supply chain and a man who knows what he's doing. One of them can be moved anywhere. The other one stays where it was built, and it keeps working, and the people who need it keep finding their way down County Road D35 because there is nowhere else to go for what it